capital of the world. Today, we're interviewing Mr. Colin Woodard, author of many books on the history of the United States, including a notable hit amongst our following, American Nations, the story of the 11 rival regional cultures that make up our history here in the United States. Colin has written extensively on many aspects of history and relevance in our country. And, as a veteran myself and as a proud citizen that, like many of us, are struggling to understand how the heck our nation got to where we are today, struggling with this tension, this conflict that at times feels irreversible. Sometimes it's hard to believe that we ever were one cohesive story. But what's really exciting and helpful about Colin's narratives is that he reassures us that this is actually who we really are. He tells us where these divides come from and how we can reconcile them as we go on in our nation's future to continue doing great things. I'm anticipating lots of live Q&A today. So please, I've built room for that into our program. Feel free to throw your questions into the chat, or if you're watching us on LinkedIn Live or Facebook, into the comments, and I'll be happy to facilitate those to Mr. Woodard. So first off, Colin, I'd love to welcome you on the show today. Thank you for being here with us.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
Right on. So let's just start off with a high level. A lot of us know you from your books. You've done you've written some tremendous narratives. I'd love to just give you an opportunity to introduce yourself in your own words and just tell us a little bit about you and your life.
Sure. I'm Colin Woodard. I'm the author of American Nations and 5 other books. Most of them are histories. My background is, I grew up in rural Maine and in university. I'm of the vintage that I started university in 1987, and so it was the height of glasnost and perestroika, and it seemed like the Cold War, the Manichaean struggle, between East and West that had dominated my entire childhood might be changing or softening, and I wanted to study that and be a part of that. That was the exciting thing then, and it seemed like Chairman Gorbachev might take actions which might shake things up. I didn't think it would be shaken up as much as it was, but I was fortunate to have been studying Eastern Europe, Russia, Balkan history, and was in Budapest, Hungary on an exchange program for my junior year in the fall of '89. So I arrived there and it was communism, and by the time I left it was gone, and I'd been fortunate enough to have witnessed many of the events of that fall firsthand, just being fortunate to have the right visas to the right countries on the right weeks and weekends. And having already been studying that and witnessing all that, I wanted to go back. So, I went back the following summer and to Romania during their messy transition from Nicolae Ceausescu. And then as soon as I graduated the following year, I basically stayed for most of the 1990s, which were most of my 20s, to see what would happen in that region. And that was, I figured out that the way that I could stay there and be paid to do what I wanted to do anyway, which is to kind of witness it all and to talk to people and have them, agree to be interviewed, was to be a journalist. And so I was a foreign correspondent, and ultimately for the San Francisco Chronicle and the Christian Science Monitor and the Chronicle of Higher Education, and traveled all over the region, based in Budapest and Zagreb. Did a graduate program at the University of Chicago, somewhere in the middle of that, for a year, studying ethnic conflict and ethno-nationalism in the Balkans, and went back and covered the aftermath in Bosnia, and then later on moved to DC and was a global affairs correspondent and traveling around. But always the lessons of that part of the world and those events that were so dramatic, in my formative years, had always been in the back of my mind, that the power that history and the past have on the present and on all of us and on the zeitgeist, and the way that humans need like a tribal sense of belonging and self-identification, and what young people searching out, trying out different identities to figure out who they are. We all do that to some extent. We pick all kinds of identities, but it can be a dangerous business for Homo sapiens, because, if you don't get and find your own identity, someone may supply one to you. And you could see that in Eastern Europe and the Balkans in a bad sense, with demagogues and recasting of what it meant to be a Hungarian or a Romanian or a Russian and all those things. And then I was starting to travel around the United States more. I lived in southernmost Texas on the Mexico border, and in Chicago, and in the DC area, and started realizing as I traveled around that the lines on the map in Eastern Europe and the Balkans aren't the real lines that matter to people. You know, like if you're traveling between Hungary and Romania, when you cross over, you know, the mountains in the middle of Romania and Transylvania, you're actually moving between the former Habsburg Empire and the former Ottoman Empire. Everything changes, you know, the architecture, the cultural values, the attitudes of the people getting on and off your train. And it's fighting words about what, you know, Transylvania really belongs to Hungary. No, it really belongs to Romania. Here's my theory. Let's fight over it. You know, that kind of stuff happened all over Eastern Europe. Well, then I was suddenly traveling around the United States and realizing that, you know, you could see these moments even within states where you'd shifted from one zone to the other. You know, I would play a game when I lived in DC with a friend of mine from graduate school who was a native of Annapolis, Maryland, where the Naval Academy is. And we'd be driving out Route 50 and head off on these side roads to get down to the Western Shore. We kept this little teeny day sailor boat that we, you know, like a 20-foot thing with a centerboard that we kept in a little town there. But when we drive around, we talk about, you know, at what mailbox is the moment where you've shifted from the culture that's a legacy of Tidewater, you know, slave plantation, Virginia and Southern Maryland, and into that other zone that was settled down from Philly and the Quaker, you know, what I call the Midlands in the book, right? Where all the names on the map go from being, you know, Anne Arundel, Prince George, Prince William County and all that, to being, you know, Fredericksburg and King of Prussia, right? There's a different zone. And we talk about, you know, where is the line exactly? And we look for markers. And then I started doing the same thing when I lived in Southmost Texas and outside Brownsville. And you drive north towards Corpus Christi or Houston, and there's that moment where you realize you've kind of left, you know, New Spain, Spanish America, and entered again the sort of deep South, and you're looking for the markers. Where's that transitional zone? And so that just all, you know, traveling around had me thinking. And then, you know, it was sometime later that I wrote American Nations. But in between the, you know, the realization that the American Nations thing was a thing and that would explain a lot about our country, and actually writing it, I had a couple of other books of history that required that I do sort of a dissertation for myself on colonial American history and really understand the past. There was one on my native state called the Lobster Coast, kind of an American Nations writ small, trying to understand what makes this idiosyncratic place I grew up tick and why are Mainers the way they are. And then another one, the Republic of Pirates, which was a back to the archives search to figure out who, you know, Blackbeard and this famous gang of pirates that have captivated pop culture ever since. What's the real deal with them, right? How do you separate fact from fiction? I went back to the archives. That was like a real PhD deep dive, you know, like going to Britain into the National Archives and digging in vellum that no one had looked at before to solve mysteries with customs records and letters from obscure naval captains and stuff to track Blackbeard and his men. But in the process, I was understanding very deeply a whole zone of colonial history in the middle. So I guess what I'm saying is that all led to the fruition point where I ended up writing American Nations. And since then there have been a couple other books. I've continued being a journalist at the same time. And here we are.
Absolutely. Well, I tell you what, it's so cool to hear about some of the origin stories about that. First off, your tremendous international experience, I think you can hear that sort of clarity of thought and judgment. It's like, look, you know, American exceptionalism can distort some people's perspective on who we really are, but you've seen so many other nations at work, you know, over the course of your career. And I think that helps you sort of craft, you know, the actual narrative as if a scientist was approaching the story of our origins. I think that's fantastic. I'm really, really grateful for that. So let's dive in. Like, this was so interesting because I grew up learning history as like, see, the British came over to the colonies built a society, they wanted to be independent. We went to war against an abusive king for that independence. We won, we became a country. That's, I think, typically how most kids in the United States learn about American history. Right. And it just is not that simple. So I want to highlight what I would personally call the four sort of anchor nations that I felt got a lot of attention in the book, and particularly because of their roots from Western Europe. And that would be Yankee Dumb, the Appalachian boderlanders, which are primarily Irish and Scots. I would love to talk to you about the Royalist Tidewater Virginia, and then, of course, the Deep South, slave-owning South, as kind of an opener to understanding. So if you were to kind of describe each of these. Like, let's start with Yankee Dumb, for example. This really seems rooted in Puritan values, and I think you describe their influences as effectively what is modern day New England. Could you tell us a little bit about this culture? And I believe it was a very powerful kickoff to the book as well.
Yeah, and you're right. I mean, the basic thesis of the book is that we ended up as in one federation together accidentally because we fought this shared conflict against the British, against a change in imperial policy that threatened the self-government of each of these places. And so they all rose up together to defend their own particular cultures and political systems and everything from outside intervention. And they were all, not only distinct, but they had values that were in contradiction to each other. And a case in point is Yankee Dumb, right? Yankee Dumb, unlike the others, was founded by a group of radical Calvinists who were trying to create, essentially a religious utopia. They believed, like the ancient Hebrews, that they were a covenanted people, that they had a special relationship with God, and that God had tasked them to do special things in the world. In this case, they were supposed to go to the New England wilderness and build a more perfect Calvinist society. And it'd be put a light on a hill and an errand in the wilderness. They were people literally on a mission. And they came as family groups, usually led by their clergymen, and they would set up in a sort of communal fashion communities that would be model communities. They would have you arrive in the wilderness, and the first thing you do is set out a meeting house and a taxpayer financed public school, and set out your commons and divide relatively equally all the lots and have a little nucleated village. It wasn't some Lord so-and-so who owns the whole thing and brings in some serfs, right? This was like a upper middle class enterprise, right? And the people who were doing it were largely from one of the most prosperous, and at this time, right, in the early 1600s, the most sort of proto-capitalist, modern part of England. In East Anglia, they were concentrated, where there was the highest level of freehold land and manufactured goods and people involved in those things. And so this was one society. And so from the beginning, they were interested in, they knew that they would be, or believed that they would be rewarded or punished by God based on whether or not they succeeded or failed as a group. And so it was really important that you kept everyone in your community on the right path, because otherwise you're all going to get in trouble, right? So it was sort of surveillance, right? It's a communal enterprise. What matters in the end isn't individual liberty, it's the success of the community as a whole. And if individual avarice, right, they believe that humans were inherently wicked, it's a Calvinist idea, you got to keep an eye on them or go astray, that there was a lot of that, right? So it's a belief in the community's success being more important than the individual if the two come in conflict, and a belief that the institutions, the magistrates and the officials are an extension of the community, right? You elect your selectmen, you control the church and the meeting house at the community level, you control the school, the central government is weak, that each town is a republic unto itself. And that's still a tradition in New England. I mean, here in New England, we still have little towns with 500, 600 people who will have almost all the powers that in most of the country would be concentrated at the county level. But no way you would ever let a county have power, right? That's a road to aristocracy. So we got to stop that, right? So that was one set of values, and entirely in contradistinction to the other societies that you described in your big four, your superpowers.
Well, this is actually a point of interest to me, because when I think of your description of the borderlanders in Appalachia, I also feel a high disdain for centralized authority. So why is it that these two couldn't see eye to eye on the formation of a civil society if they both equally are, maybe not equally, but they both similarly have such high disdain for centralized authority? Why is it that the Yankees and Yankee Dumb and the Appalachian borderlands weren't able to coalesce? And even to this day, there seems to be this massive rift between the two.
Yeah, I mean, they'd shared that thing in common, right? A distrust of aristocracy and inherited power and people lording over you that was frowned upon. And even more so in Greater Appalachia. But the difference, almost everything else was different, right? In Greater Appalachia, that region was settled primarily by people fleeing the war-ravaged borderlands of the British Isles, the English Marches, the lowlands of Scotland, and especially Ulster. And many of the settlers were Scots-Irish. And the history of that region was quite a bit different, right? This is a place where institutions and the rule of law are extremely weak, where armies are slaughtering people and going over the land and pillaging all the time, and you can't count on magistrates or institutions. You have to count on yourself, right? You have to protect your kith, your kin, and your cattle and your sheep. It was a pastoral society yourself, right? And if government is considered a bad thing, because it's usually comes in the form of a bunch of cavalrymen trying to mow down your family with lances. So the emphasis was always on individual autonomy and personal liberty, right? Individual liberty is freedom. And the creation of institutions and magistrates and courts and all of that was seen in the Scots-Irish context as the road to tyranny. In other words, all the things that Yankee New Englanders were naturally and reflexively building to, in their thinking, protect a free, it became a free society, protect their way of absolutely antithesis of that in Appalachia, where you didn't want any of that, right? You wanted to keep, individuals as empowered as possible, have, no taxes, no sheriffs, no magistrates, as much as possible, and that way you wouldn't let any aristocrats form, right? A distrust of institutions and an emphasis on the individual. So common good, building a free community, and individual liberty, that's a huge tension point in the American story. In fact, that's the flashpoint in most of our politics pre-Trump, had been a fight between those two ideas of how you build a free society. And Greater Appalachia and Yankee Dumb were on opposite poles in that spectrum.
That is very insightful. So it's like, the idea of aristocracy, like everybody can decide that they dislike that. That's a given. But that actually is relatively table stakes for this part of these parts of the country. There's like, listen, one side is going to really stress on those individual liberties at potential expense of the community well-being, even though that's not necessarily an aristocracy. Centralized power and community aren't necessarily the same things for Yankees, whereas they effectively were both centralization of authority that was in direct violation of individual liberties for the Appalachian borderlanders. Is that fair?
Yeah, and there were times when, because of their commonalities, they were allies more than they were enemies. I mean, even the Revolutionary period, even the Civil War. I mean, if you think about it, Greater Appalachia was on the Union side in the Civil War, right? Mm-hmm. Kentucky didn't leave, Maryland didn't leave. The western part of Virginia seceded from the Confederacy to form West Virginia. The same thing, there was an attempt to do that in the eastern part of Tennessee as well, that had to be put down by force of arms. In the Appalachian north of Alabama, the Free State of Winston, same thing. Huge efforts had to be made by the Confederate States of America to put down rebellions and attempts to leave the Confederacy within Greater Appalachian portions of their states. So it wasn't until Reconstruction when essentially Reconstruction was a Yankee-led effort to take a conquered territory, maybe analogous to Iraq, for instance. You have a conquered territory, and we're going to try to impose via an occupation our values and hope that our school systems and our institutions will take hold, right? And that's what Yankee tried to do in the Confederacy, right? They sent Yankee school teachers, with Union troops backing them, and tried to redo the way everything was done, including the political emancipation of African Americans, which was absolutely antithesis of what these Southerners wanted to have happen. But the side story for Greater Appalachia is that was so offensive that during an occupation that the Yankees were trying to, build taxpayer financed schools and little institutions and all the things that were coded as being very bad in Greater Appalachia. That's the moment where Greater Appalachia joins Dixie and becomes, the South, I guess you could say.
So then let's dive into Royalist Virginia, the Tidewater area, because I think this is where I was raised in Southern Virginia.
Yeah.
a little bit
Whereabouts?
closer to the Roanoke, southern suburb of
Yeah.
Roanoke, if you could call Roanoke.
I've had some assignments in Roanoke. It's a great town.
It's a great town. We had a lot of fun there. Blue Ridge Mountains are beautiful. But I'll tell you what, when I think of the relationship to that's actually described in your book as a part of the New World that was very aligned with the monarchy of England and the landed gentry. It was effectively a landed extension of the landed gentry of England. My mind was blown. And I think when it really hit me was when you were like, hey, just think about the naming structure of Virginia, Prince William County. The name Virginia is for the Queen Virgin. Like, it's so much of this state is actually rooted in British monarchy. So can you talk to us a little bit about how Virginia sort of plays into this relationship between Appalachia and the Deep South, which was very agrarian, very high slave owning, very capitalist, very much arguably to a fault. I would love to see how Virginia fits into this story.
Yeah, well, I mean, early Virginia and southern parts of Maryland. Maryland was dominated by a similar society in the early decades. They were founded roughly the same time as New England, and they were founded by English people, right? So they should be the same, but totally different, because it wasn't the Puritan, white fleet arriving and trying to, deploy this Calvinist utopia. It was instead the most conservative society you could imagine. It was essentially, the operation was run after the English Civil War by great aristocrats, right? The second, third, fourth, fifth sons of the great English countryside families, right? Kind of like a 17th century version of, Downton Abbey, like Lord Grantham and his family, right? And the Lord Grantham's son is going to get Downton Abbey. What happens to, the rest of the family members? Well, it used to be you were out of luck, right? You have to go to the clergy or go join the army. There's nothing for you to do here. But with the discovery of the New World, it was suddenly possible for the second, third, fourth, the non-inheriting sons to have the possibility of creating a landed estate of their own in the New World. And many of them came to Virginia and to Maryland in order to try to do that, to replicate the manners of the English countryside, literally aristocratic manners that they'd left behind. So, that's why you fast forward, the founders from Virginia, you've got, George Mason and George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, and they're all, James Madison, they all have these grand Enlightenment estates, manned by slave populations, right? It was they're kind of lords or aristocrats, because that was the outgrowth of the model. Originally the idea was it would be just like England. The only difference would be, instead of having to send the produce of your manor to London via wagons, you would send it from your landing, in one of the creeks of Virginia, and send it right back to the same docks in London. It might even get there faster, because the wagon roads were so bad. But that was the model. Be self-sufficient. Early Virginia and Maryland didn't really have any towns. The capital, Williamsburg, was basically a campus that was sort of open for government to show up, with a palace in it for the governor, not a state house. Manicured lawns. It was like an Enlightenment, governing playground for this aristocracy. And so each manor was trying to be self-sufficient. The original idea was that they would be serfs and they would hang out on the land. But lo and behold, in the context of the New England, the Virginia wilderness, you couldn't find anybody who was willing to stick around and play the role of the serfs. So, originally they tried indentured servitude, and when that didn't work, by the time of getting to the late part of the 17th century, they turned to the model that Deep South had perfected, a full-on racial slave and caste system, so kind of a total horror show. The difference between Deep South and Tidewater is Tidewater's initial plan was, let's be just like rural England. And that failed, and then they ended up falling into it. Whereas the Deep South, which we'll get to in a minute, was a slave society, West Indies style, from the very beginning.
Yeah, and I gotta say, some of the things about the Deep South that I read about, I mean, especially last year, I think a lot of us, quite frankly, even the founding of this program, 99 Pages, was rooted in trying to use books as a means to understand parts of our country that a lot of us aren't familiar with. I think we all who've read the book get a deeper sense of the horrors of what slavery really was and what drove it, which, if I can, it just sounded like pure unadulterated greed. I just could not think of any other word. So can we talk about what happened in the southern states? How, I mean, we're talking about West Indies style plantations that were trying to expand. They needed to come over to the United States, and they brought this torturous culture with them. I would love to hear what you discovered as you were researching this part of our country.
Yeah, so I mean, the third of the superpowers, the Deep South, which got its beginning around Charleston, South Carolina, and then expanded over the lowlands, where you could grow cotton and the like, that had its beginnings not with these second and third sons of English gentry, but rather with planters from the West Indies, the British West Indies, and specifically from Barbados, which was a sugar plantation where in the English colonial world, that's where the full-on, horror show slave society with chain gangs and, where 80% of the population is enslaved and staggering amounts of money are being made generating sugar for export, and lives are meaninglessly cheap. If you can get a profit out of someone by working them to death, you do. That whole experience happened in Barbados in the generations preceding the founding of Charleston and the Carolinas. And Barbados, though, is a small place, right? And there was a struggle, survival for the fittest battle between the planters and, everyone. And eventually a few of them won and were dominating Barbados. But there's only so much land. If they wanted to expand, they had to go somewhere else. And the subtropical lowlands of the North American continent and the new Carolina colony that was later split into North and South Carolina was a place where the stuff they wanted to grow could be grown, and there was an opportunity for a proprietary colony. And so the South Carolinians, so the Barbadians basically came and founded South Carolina as an extension of their West Indies society, and created and deployed this full-on, slave system with chain gangs and everything else from the very, very beginning. And then it spread into, southern part of Georgia, and then on into, as the Mississippi Territory was created and Alabama split off from it, and onwards into parts of Texas and elsewhere. This was a place that was not that committed to, was definitely not committed to any idea of equality, but even liberal democratic ideas were not, were frowned upon, right? The model was a classical republicanism, right? The republicanism of the ancient or classic world of ancient Greece and Rome, which were societies, when you think about it, where, a small elite of the population at the very top of your pyramid had the liberty or the privilege to practice democracy and all these things, and servitude and slavery were the natural lot of the multitudes. And that was considered to be, by the Carolinians and many other thinkers in the 1600s, to be the only way a republic could exist. And so that idea remained, not only into the founding period, but it's certainly propelling the Civil War, and in many respects is still kind of encoded in our battles we have today.
Yeah, there's a quote from your book that I pulled out that really stuck with me. If you don't mind, I'd love to read it, because I think it encapsulates the message here about the goal. The goal of the deep Southern oligarchy has been consistent for over 4 centuries: to control and maintain a one-party state with a colonial-style economy based on large-scale agriculture and the extraction of primary resources by a compliant, poorly educated, low-wage workforce with as few labor, workplace safety, healthcare, and environmental regulations as possible. That is a deeply disturbing way to describe it, but it's like, man, how else can you describe the roots of that, vicious agrarian slave owning culture? It's very hurtful. And I guess, for me, the more I read about our nation's history, and forget just slave owning, even our racism, our relationship with civil rights in this country, lynchings, etc., I struggle a lot. I'm very proud of my country, very proud of, our aspirational ideals, what we aim to be. And I'm curious, as you went through this book and through writing it, reading it, digesting it, like, talk us about the journey of your patriotism, and how do you feel now as an American, knowing what you know about some of the in-depth struggles and moral failings that we come with? Like, how should we as Americans reconcile those?
Right. Well, I think my journey, being from rural Maine in the middle of nowhere, you sort of assume, I think all of us assume that the cultural space, the region we're from, and whatever values you encounter must be the normal values everywhere when you're a kid, right, in the United States, right, that we all hold these in common. And it wasn't until I started traveling in other parts of the country I started realizing that that wasn't true at all, that these were idiosyncratic to New England. And when I came back from being a foreign correspondent, was based in DC, and I was primarily on a global affairs beat. I was traveling all over the world, Micronesia, Asia, Antarctica and stuff. But just being in DC, starting to really follow more closely the dynamics in Congress, even then in the late 90s. Gingrich and the revolution had come in, the Monica Lewinsky scandal. I mean, that's the moment when the wheels started coming off the bus that led us to today, is, mid 90s in Washington. And you could see, though, that it was primarily a regional struggle. I mean, you could see the battle of values that many people, like Gingrich and many of his supporters, that the beginnings of that geographic divide that matches American nations was playing out. And so, the realization there was sort of a struggle or an extension of the Civil War starting to occur in the late 90s was already in my head a bit. And then as I started, really unpacking it and going into the history and stuff, I started gathering the complexities of it. So I guess the disappointment of realizing somewhere in there that, we weren't one country with a shared set of values. We weren't all on the same page about how to create a free society, or even our commitment to a liberal democracy, small l, small d, that wasn't there. Yeah, that's, kind of alarming, but increasingly obvious, by 2000 even, or 2001 or so. Since then, I've done 2 more books in addition to American Nations that really explore that, including our the battle over, this book here, the Union, which is the most recent one, is about the battle over the creation of our story of who we are and why we're together, and where we came from and where we're supposed to be going and what our ideals are. And those ideals, the ones that really turn people's heads, the ones that are in the preamble to the Declaration of Independence, which were really revolutionary at the time they were first written down and are still inspiring, right? The inherent equality of humans, their natural rights, their inalienable sort of inborn rights to life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness and representative self-government. Those are pretty good values, basically, for a founding ideals of a country. But, very obviously to everyone, I hope by now, that we never have achieved those ideals, right? How could you, when you had, half of the country was in fact a, slave-holding, race-based caste system, propelled and enforced by deadly violence, all the way up practically into living memory. I mean, Jim Crow and the overthrow of that system in the South, even in formal terms, happened in the 60s. That's really, really recently, and obviously, that didn't that didn't actually solve any of those problems. So yeah, that it's the I'm still inspired in the patriotism sense of those ideals are wonderful ones, and a hope for a species that has only been thinking about the possibility of a society where you could have widespread individual freedom and rights and respect. That just as an idea, that's only a few centuries old, right? We have 5,000 years of human history of civilizations, and only in the past 400 anyone think of that idea. And we've only been trying to do it for 250 years and doing it badly and making terrible mistakes. And maybe that's not surprising, but it's both the, it's moving that those ideals exist and have spread through the world as, for many people as aspirational ones. And what drives the fury against the United States, and I think a lot of young people feel this, is the betrayal of those ideals. The fact that, our history told us that we were committed to them, and obviously we weren't, right? We failed in that anger, right? That in fact, founded in racism and all these, especially in certain regions of the country, truly built on it, that's a betrayal, and therefore you should throw the whole country and the ideals out, right? But the ideals, we never achieved them. It's the beauty of them and the fight for them that I find inspiring. So it's tragedy and it's inspirational at the same time. And, our struggle in the United States is a very human struggle, right? Humans are very flawed. We are all over the world. Other liberal democracies have almost any country, if you pick at it, has a terrible story underneath it. And many of them are all in a crisis. Our peer liberal democracies are in crisis today. So, to me, it's America's story is a sort of is a human story and is inspirational. But we got to fight for it, right? We got to fight for those ideals in the Declaration. They're not going to fight for themselves, and sort of the inertia of human society is drives towards despotism and autocracy because of greed and stuff. So you got to fight for it, and now it's another time when that has to happen. So I guess those are all patriotic ideas, right? But it's not complacency. I guess it's a loss of complacency. Over time up to a point of, absolute urgency with January 6th.
Very compelling. And I love how you put it in the framework of, look, when we look at 5, arguably even 10,000 years of human existence and, 5,000 years of civilization, the vast majority of it have been really bad. The ideas of equality, freedom, a state that works for the people, by the people, is actually a relatively novel idea. And the inertia of human existence isn't necessarily, in accordance with those ideals. So it's not like a given that we're going to succeed at them, but they are aspirational. We're going to work for them every day. Thank you for sharing that. I would love to, if it's okay with you, turn to some of the audience questions. Our chat's been going pretty active. Would love to bring in some folks. And if you have questions in it and you're watching out there, feel free to throw them in the chat. Eager to hear from you. I'd love to start with Mr. Raid Amin. He asks, have nations maintained their demographic characteristics over the past several hundred years, or did they change with time? And I think this question is kind of interesting because, on one end, there's sort of like the geographic element of where these nations rooted. Right. And of course, a lot of these areas have diversified, have brought in lots of other peoples, but, in many ways, the political culture or ethnographic values haven't necessarily changed. So right. I'm curious to hear how these nations, in your opinion, have evolved over time.
Yeah, how can that be, right? We have, mass communications and mass media and mass marketing, and people move around, and huge waves of immigration into this country. How could these, different colonial era cultures still be persisting, right? The idea is that these different competing colonial cultures and regional cultures each colonized and sort of formatted the culture of a different strip of the Middle West, I guess you'd say, out a little beyond the Mississippi River through the 1840s, and that became extensions of these different regional cultures and kind of laid down their values. So how could that possibly still be the case? And I mean, my observation is we know it's persisted because if you look by any possible metric, politics and attitudes, and do you like individual freedom or the common good, and your attitudes about church and state and proper role of government, and ethno-nationalism versus a civic nationhood, they all track on these, at the county level, vaccination rates, right? Where's the vaccine hesitancy? Look at your per capita rate today. Look at the masking rates a year ago. Look at gun violence per capita. Slice and dice it however you want. Only do rural, only do white on white violence or black on black. You'll still see this staggering variance following these settlement patterns. So how can that, we know it's persisted. The question is then, how is it persisted? How could that possibly be the case? And I don't have all the answers, but some of them are that, the general idea of the paradigm is that our country and North America are like anywhere else in the world, that culture exists, it's out in the zeitgeist around you. Immigrants can come in, we can arrive from Mars or move from Yankee Dumb to the left coast, and we ourselves may be carrying the values of Mars when we arrived. And our brother's family may, we arrive in Yankee Dumb, brother's family goes to the deep south, we're all from Mars, and we still, remember our, Martian diet and pine for home. But our children, they speak Martian, but they also went to kindergarten, they speak the local language, and their friends, it's kind of a little weird that all the Martian food we eat and all that kind of stuff. So they're kind of interplay. And then their kids, right, they end up marrying maybe not a Martian, and their kids maybe don't remember the language at all, but know nominally that grandpa came from Mars, but they're actually, have acculturated to the place around them. My argument is they haven't acculturated to America. One Martian family by the grandkids generation has acculturated to Yankee Dumb, and the other one to the deep south, right down to the dialect of American English that they speak, right? So that's the general, that's how it works everywhere in the world, right? If you or I moved to France or to Japan, we wouldn't be French or Japanese, but our grandkids might, right? In fact, they almost certainly would be. So that's the paradigm, right? So, that culture will win out in the end. Despite the fact that everyone's, people are moving around, the other factor is that as people have tracked those who move from one regional culture to another, it turns out basically what social science is telling us is that the people who move statistically are more like their destination than their point of origin. In other words, in every county on the American nation's map and every town, you have pretty much the full spectrum of individual opinion, right? From, Ayn Randers down to hardcore communists, right? In every town. But the dominant zeitgeist tends to be in accordance with the dominant culture. Well, if you're one of those people in the deep, you're in the deep South and you're a liberal-minded atheist, or you're in Yankee Dumb and you're a hardcore libertarian and Southern Baptist, you may be very frustrated with the dominant values around you, right? You may, all these, unaddressed, unconscious assumptions of the society around you. You may think, gosh, it's so frustrating here. If I could only leave and go somewhere else where people thought like X, Y, and Z, I'd do it in a minute. If my job ever said you need to relocate and I had a choice where to go, I'd pick somewhere like me. And that's what people are doing, right? Statistically speaking, as people are moving around, it's people voting with their feet. They're tending to relocate, and as a countervailing force against, the purpleization of the map is the fact that people aren't moving around randomly. They're self-selecting, and as they do so, they're helping increase the differences by the big sort effect between the regional cultures.
That's so fascinating because it actually goes, almost, I hate to say it goes against the concept, like the values that we think of when we say, hey, we want a diverse area or a diverse population, because it sounds like assimilation to sort of rooted culture seems to be what ends up becoming the norm, which is a very interesting observation. I'd love to bring in Miss Grace Lee, who actually wants to ask us, what can history tell us about these settlers out west? And I think this is something that we didn't actually touch on quite yet, which is really two phenomenon. One was El Norte, which is, one thing that I think in American history we don't talk enough about is the Spanish occupation of the New World, where they had been working in California and many parts of the West for long before we sent Lewis and Clark out there, right? Like it is incredible. Like we didn't just venture out into the complete wilderness. Like obviously there was that, but we had a huge Spanish population and Spanish occupation in the West, and then El Norte, as the Mexican influence and native influence came up north, they have created its own culture, distinct nation, if you will. So what are some of the tenets of this part of the country, both El Norte and the far west in California and the Pacific Northwest?
Yeah, the two are quite different. El Norte is, as you suggested, I mean, it's the Spanish colonized region of what's now the United States and northern Mexico, because Spain was the big colonial power, the biggest of them all in the 16th century. And got its start way ahead of England, when England was a puny little island that could be forgotten about. Spain was this enormous superpower, and it was colonizing south to north up into North America, and reached what's now Texas and New Mexico and California, not until the waning years of the 16th century into the 17th century, but way before the United States settlers and started colonizing from east to west. And but in the technology of that time period, being in whatever Brownsville or Taos or San Francisco or what's now Los Angeles, over the wagon roads and stuff, it was like they were on the moon, right? They were so far removed from Mexico City. It took months to move things by, wagon carts and the like, and even more removed from Madrid, that it was almost like they're on lunar bases, right? That you were far, far away. You had to improvise, and it quickly created a very distinct and different society in the North. And the North was, had to be more entrepreneurial, independent, a more level society, less hierarchical and aristocratic. It was there wasn't the same, in central Mexico, you'd have the Blancos, who were alleged to be pure-blooded, European Spanish, were at the top of the pyramid, and as you work your way down into gradations of how much, indigenous, American people's blood did you have in you, you'd be lower down the totem pole. That was not true in the North, because in the North, there was nobody who could claim to be 100% Spanish. And so that kind of faded away as well. So it was a place that started to see itself as distinct from and maybe in opposition to the authorities in central Mexico. They didn't understand us. They neglect us. Our economy, it would be easier to trade with these Americans showing up and, just took over Louisiana. We ought to go in that direction. So there was almost a sort of movement, a consciousness of being a transitional culture, stuck in between two superpowers and not wanting to be part of either of them, but wanting to have your own independent third way. And so there were secession movements, pretty early on in Mexican history, the Republic of the Rio Grande, even the Republic of Texas. I mean, Austin and his Anglos, were leading it, but it had the backing of the entire Spanish-speaking aristocracy of Texas, because they were trying to get away from central Mexico. So yeah, a land in between that hoped to have a third way and be a sort of buffer and trading partner between these two superpowers, but of course that was not to be. So settled, that's in the entire United States, the place with the longest sustained European colonial history is that part of our map, not Virginia and Quebec, but rather New Mexico. So that's often forgotten now. The other section of the interior West, not the coastal strip, between Monterey, California, and like Juneau, Alaska, is its own culture, but the rest of the interior West, starting around the 100th meridian and extending all the way up to the coastal and Cascade Mountains. That entire interior is the one place where, I call it the far West, and it's the one place that I would admit that environmental factors totally trump these ethnographic ones that we talk about with all the other regional cultures, because it was the last place that was colonized by these various Euro-American settlement groups. And in the technology of that time period, in the second half of the 19th century, I mean, it was high and dry and remote and just staggeringly difficult to get there and settle or move goods or anything else. And the indigenous inhabitants who didn't want the colonization to be taking place, still had the upper hand for a lot of that time period. So it was dangerous for the would-be colonizers as well. So it was, it ended up being a place where it could only be successfully colonized through the pre-deployment of staggering amount, industrial scale capital flows, right? You had to have the railroads built, the transcontinental railroads, and the aluminum, silver smelters, and mining equipment, and massive irrigation, schemes and dams and stuff that only these big, industrial corporations based outside of the far West in San Francisco and Chicago and New York, or the federal government could provide. And so it was treated as an interior, like the railroads came first, and then the railroads set up the settlements and brought in the settlers, right? Not the other way around. The smelter came first, the mine came first, and the people followed, but it was always treated as this sort of internal resource colony by the other regional cultures, to the lasting resentment and setting of the tempo of the people of the colonized far West, not, appreciating that, and that resistance and anger, either at some points in its history towards the Anaconda Coppers and the Hearsts and the Union Pacific Railways of the world, but more recently mostly towards the federal government, which still owns and controls a majority of the land in most of the far western states.
Very compelling. Actually, one of our viewers, this book should be on every university reading syllabus, not only for American history, but for human anthropology. I could not agree more. Colin, I tell you what, that's such an interesting part of it. Like one of the only nations where it was actually the environment that dictates the nature of that culture. I hadn't actually considered that before. And I live up in the mountains in Tahoe, not too far away from this area. And sometimes we laugh. It's in the sense it's like, yeah, you can't farm there, but it's a good thing. People go off-roading there. We have Burning Man in the middle of the Black Rock Desert. Like, we're finding utility for it, but it's very different than what I think we all thought it would end up being. I wanted to end on one question that I really thought was super fascinating. It's, and especially as a religious minority myself, I grew up very infatuated with this idea that, religious freedom is at the heart of our Constitution, of our Declaration of Independence. We have the right to worship however we want. Yet, as you unpack when we describe these first Eastern colonies, that, hey, if you look around, religious diversity really wasn't the norm. In fact, you astutely point out, New York City, the Dutch colony, if you will, of New York, was really the only place where, say, a large Jewish population felt at home. And really where we saw any, melting pot, if you will, that we try and aspire to. It really, New York City it's not only that's a part of its own history, but it's also to this day one of the most diverse cities in the world. And I wanted to kind of touch on this. Why, was New York the home of this sort of melting pot ideal, this religious diversity? And two, where did we as a nation get the idea that this was, when we actually are very religiously divided in our history, why do we have this notion that, we were founded on religious freedom? Just kind of curious on your thoughts.
Yeah, I think it's misunderstood like a lot of things. The Bill of Rights originally was only thought to constrain the federal government, not the states, not the colonies. And that was in the founding generation by design, right? The idea was that they had all, as I said, ended up in a alliance of convenience with each other to defend a shared threat from Britain. And then they all suddenly found themselves in a United States together. Nobody knew what that was. Is it like NATO? Is it like the EU? Is it supposed to be a nation state like, Prussia or post-revolutionary France that we're building? A Hamiltonian state? Well, nobody knew. And they would fight a civil war about it and still not be entirely certain about it. But it was assumed by many, and certainly in the beginning, before the second constitution, the present constitution, that the states were sovereign, the colonies were sovereign. And while the federal government couldn't pass any law that would interfere with religion, the central impulse was that the federal government, that they were feared that the federal government would be controlled by some coalition of regions and would force the values on another of the regions. And so, New England and Yankee Dumb wanted to protect the Puritan/Congregational church, which in Massachusetts and Maine and other places was the established church. In other words, it was paid for by taxpayer money. It was an official church that the state provided funding for, like the Lutheran Church in Sweden today or something like that. So not at the state level, it was a privileged institution. In Virginia, it was the Anglican Church had those kind of privileges, which became the Episcopalian Church, right? Because we have bishops, but we've gotten rid of the king and the Church of England. And so different colonies were trying to defend their own dominant religion from interference in the original interpretation. A couple of the regions, though, their regional cultures, values were based on tolerance, particularly New Netherland, right? The area around New York City, northern New Jersey, Westchester, parts of Long Island, was founded by the Dutch, not by the English, and was founded with that Dutch philosophy of freedom of inquiry and conscience and tolerance. I mean, tolerance can go both ways, right? Tolerant of slavery, tolerant of slave catchers, tolerant of anything, but also tolerant of various immigration groups and the Dutch were never in a majority, right? Even at the beginning, they were like 10% of the population when it was a village, and it never got better from there. So any religion could be there. There was no established dominant default religious tradition, and there was tolerance of many coming. So that was a safe place for people persecuted elsewhere in the world to come and also not be interfered with by, Puritan magistrates or, the vestry gentlemen at the local courthouse in Virginia or whatever. And also, as you go down into the Midlands, which were founded initially by William Penn's Quakers, right? The notion of the Delaware Bay colonies was also inherently tolerant. They were founded as a Quaker utopia, but the Quakers, unlike the Calvinists, believed in the inherent goodness of humans, right? And they have an inner light. And so everything will turn out fine. Come on in, right? They had a pretty open immigration policy, allowing people of various religions. And, so you had all sorts of, Mennonites and Anabaptists and Amish and, Germans fleeing the Palatinates, and later the Germans fleeing the 1848 revolutions, and the Scots-Irish. The reason Greater Appalachia forms, it forms first in the back country of Pennsylvania because the Quaker-dominated authorities in Philly were like, sure, you can come, go to the frontier, do what you want, right? So that ended up also being a place where many religious persuasions could show up and practice, and that was fine because that was the model, right? A mosaic of cultures side by side, retaining their own, way of doing things and no dominant culture overhead. But that's confined to just small strips of the United States, right? That's contrary. Even Yankee Dumb, at its best, Yankee Dumb attracted tons of immigrants, but the notion has always been melting pot, right? You can come here, but you must become like us. Maybe you don't have to be a Congregationalist, but we have these taxpayer-financed public schools in the 19th century, but it also has a curriculum that is very clearly coded towards making you all good, Marx Weberian, Protestants, right? And so the Catholics are like, no way, we're going to set up our own parochial schools, and that caused lots of friction because you're not assimilating. You came here, right? Whereas that wouldn't have been an issue in the Midlands or in New Netherlands. So that's kind of the backstory to it. But that all got confused later, right? When the Bill of Rights, starts being interpreted post-Civil War as, is a right for all individuals, and state governments can't interfere with that. Then we sort of reverse imagined that at the beginning there was freedom, personal freedom, and individual freedom of religion must have been the impetus. Far from the Puritans were about as intolerant of other religions in the colonial period as you could possibly imagine, right? And they were coming for religious freedom, their own, not anyone else's, right?
Very important distinction, I will say that. Look, Colin, I did a horrible job managing our time today. I just really enjoyed it. I mean, I honestly it was so fun to hear you just give body to this really powerful piece of work. Before we go, I want to give you an opportunity to talk about your other two books that you've published recently, namely Character and Unity, which I think are fun. I mean, if you enjoyed American Nations, and you saw on the social media engagement, folks, this was a very beloved book across our following. I am very keen to now start on Character and Unity. Could you tell us a little bit about what to expect?
So it's now a trilogy. I mean, after American Nations, I did two other books. The last one just came out last year. American Characters, this one, it's essentially, this came out in 2006, I was writing in 2015. It came out in 2016, a little ahead of Donald Trump clinching the Republican nomination. So didn't quite see that specific thing happening. The book was about how do you protect and sustain a liberal democracy in general, and ours in particular. Ours in particular, given the balkanized nature of the country described in American Nations. How do you manage to how could you build again, how did it happen in the past, how could you do it now, a super majority of the regional cultures? What would they agree on that you could form as a political philosophy for whatever, one of the parties or a new party or whatever, that could actually successfully control the levers of power in the federal government and, lead the country forward at a time when it was paralyzed? And we better do it, the book warned, because, iceberg ahead if we don't, right? The country is very brittle. The increase in inequity, legal and material and otherwise, is growing rapidly because of a disconnect between those two forces I talked about, right? The subtitle of the book is The Epic Struggle Between Individual Liberty and the Common Good. We've gone way too far over on the individual liberty side in recent decades, and it's destabilized the necessary equilibrium. So that's that book. I think it's essential because that's how we right the ship again when we get a chance to right the ship. And how do we stabilize ourselves to make our country healthy again so that nothing like we're in now ever happens again? That would be the story. But the book came out and then we hit the iceberg like 3 seconds later, right? So understandably, rather than everyone wanting to read a book about how to avoid the iceberg, everyone's like, where's the lifeboats, right? So the new book is about something more fundamental, Union, which is about, where did the story, the idea that we were one peoples, that myth that concealed the differences between the nations that many of us grew up with, where did that come from? And when did it come? who wrote it, how did they succeed in propagating it, why were they doing it? And quickly, what I discovered when I went back, it starts in the 1830s, is that there wasn't one story, there were two, almost immediately. One is that story of those ideals we were talking about earlier, connected to the Declaration of Independence, our liberal democratic and inspirational values. The other one, the counter story that came almost immediately out of the Deep South, you'll be shocked to hear, was that no, Jefferson was wrong. We are, humans are not equal, and in fact, only one set of humans have the genius and the capabilities to practice those ideals in the Declaration. That's the, allegedly superior Anglo-Saxon race, full stop. And the United States is a collection of the homelands of the superior Anglo-Saxon people, and everybody else is here provisionally to be enslaved or on leave or probation. And that was the ethno-national argument. We are a homeland of a specific people, right? And ethno-nationalism is always about, it's not everybody who belongs, somebody doesn't. And that, the book traces how that changed over time, right? It became, Anglo-Saxons, a pretty flexible concept. Saxons, oh, I guess that means Germans, we can bring them in, and pretty soon you can change it to any kind of Protestant, maybe eventually bring in Catholics. Okay, we'll let the Greeks in and the Hungarians in, but always somebody else is out, right? We're going to exclude the Chinese, or later we're going to exclude the Muslims, not you, right? You're too strange, right? So, but it's always somebody is not the real Americans. Anyway, it's about the battle, the struggle between those forces, and how deep the ethno-national one goes. The same fight that we saw on January 6th on the steps of the Capitol has been raged, since the 1830s, and that's why the curse goes back so deep. But also the inspirational struggle by the people on the civic national side. It's been a tough slog for a long time.
Indeed, it has. Well, sir, I hope you don't mind if we have our following read those two books and we have you back on the show to promote them, because I think they're vitally important to our country. And we had a lot of engagement over the course of this past hour with you. I think a lot of heads turned, a lot of people getting excited about your work. I think we had like 50 or 60 people on LinkedIn just watching it. So thank you so much, Colin. I think not just for coming on the program, I thought this was a phenomenal discussion, but just for the hard work you put in. Folks, like, writing nonfiction is a labor of love, right? It is, and these authors that we have on, particularly guys like Colin, that are putting their heart and soul into these stories, it is just so meaningful for our national fabric. And so, Colin, just thank you very much for writing this book. Your hard work is going totally appreciated, totally noticed, and I just hope you feel that from us here at 99
Well, thank you. Thanks so much for your interest in having me on. It was a great pleasure. We'll have to do it again.
Absolutely. All right, 99 pages. Thank you so much. We're going to be back in a couple of weeks with another great set of programming. Enjoy the next few weeks and this end of your summer. Take care.